Right now, the lights are on. You didn't think about it. You flipped a switch, or you didn't even do that much, and the power was just there. Same as always. Boring even. Now here's the part that should stop you. Somewhere, maybe 100 miles away, maybe closer, there's a chunk of metal smaller than your thumb that is quietly tearing atoms apart to keep that switch working. Not burning, not exploding, splitting, pulling apart the tiniest pieces of matter there are, millions of times a second, in a building most people drive past without a second look. And here's the joke almost nobody tells you about the whole thing. All of that, the most advanced energy source humans have ever built, the thing people argue about and make disaster movies out of, exists to do one dumb, simple job. It boils water. That's it. That's the secret. A nuclear reactor is a very expensive, very dangerous way to make a pot of water get hot. The steam spins a fan. The fan spins a magnet. The magnet makes your electricity. A campfire under a kettle does the same trick. The difference is where the heat comes from, and where the heat comes from is one of the strangest stories in all of science. So, let me show you what's really going on in there, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start with the fuel, because the fuel is the whole show. Inside a reactor, there are little ceramic pellets. Each one is about the size of a pencil eraser. You could hold a handful of them, if they weren't deadly to touch. And one of those pellets, that little gray cylinder you could lose in your pocket, holds about as much usable energy as a ton of coal. A whole ton. Picture a pickup truck bed piled high with black rock, and then picture something the size of a gumdrop doing the same job. How? Where is all that energy hiding? It's hiding inside the atom itself, specifically inside a type of uranium called U-235. And the reason it's so packed is a rule Einstein figured out that most people can quote but almost nobody really feels. E equals mc squared. In plain talk, that means mass is just energy that's been folded up and put away. A tiny bit of mass, if you can pry it loose, unfolds into a stupefying amount of energy. That's what a reactor does. It pries it loose, and it does it by playing a game of catch with the smallest ball in the universe. Here's the actual moment. This is the heartbeat of the whole machine. A single neutron, one loose particle drifting through the fuel, drifts into a uranium atom. The atom is heavy, crowded, and unstable, like a drop of water hanging off a faucet, right at the edge of falling. The neutron is the nudge. The atom shivers, stretches, and splits in two. And when it splits, three things come flying out. Heat, which is the part we actually want. Two smaller atoms, the leftover pieces, and 2 or 3 more neutrons, thrown loose in every direction. Sit with those last neutrons for a second, because they change everything. 1 neutron went in, 2 or 3 came out. Each one of those can go find another uranium atom and split it, which throws out more neutrons, which split more atoms. 1 becomes 2 becomes 4 becomes 8, faster than you can think, and now you don't have one split, you have a wave of them tearing through the fuel. That's a chain reaction. That's the engine. And left completely alone, running wild, it's the same physics that lives inside a bomb. So the obvious question is the scary one. What stops it? Why isn't every power plant a crater? Here's the first thing keeping you safe, and it's built into the fuel before it ever gets near the reactor. The uranium in a bomb is almost pure U-235, something like 90% of it or more, refined until it's basically nothing but the explosive stuff. The uranium in a power plant is watered down on purpose. Only about 3 to 5% of it is U-235. The rest is a heavier cousin that mostly just sits there and refuses to split. It's like trying to start a bonfire with wood that's 95% wet. You can get a slow, steady burn if you work at it. You cannot get an explosion. The fuel physically can't do it. That's not luck. That's design. But a slow burn is still a burn, and it still wants to run away from you. So there's a second trick, and it's the one that turns a bomb's physics into a machine you can actually control. Here's something that sounds backwards. To make the reactor work, you have to slow the neutrons down. When a uranium atom splits, the neutrons come screaming out way too fast, and a fast neutron is almost useless. It blows right past the next uranium atom without catching, like a bullet going through a target too quick to knock it over. If every neutron stayed that fast, the chain reaction would sputter and die. So the reactor is flooded with ordinary water. Not for cooling, at least not yet. The water is there to be a wall the neutrons bounce off of. Every time a neutron cracks into a water molecule, it loses a little speed. Bounce, 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 and by the time it comes out the other side, it's crawling. And a slow neutron is a sticky neutron. It gets caught. It causes the next split. So the water is holding the reaction together, which sets up one of the sneakiest safety features in the entire design. And it's almost poetic. If the core gets too hot and the water starts to boil into steam, you suddenly have less water. Less water means fewer neutrons get slowed down. Fewer slow neutrons means fewer splits. The reaction cools itself off. It's got its own brake pedal built out of physics. And the pedal presses itself the second things get too wild. That's when it's built right. Because the flip side of that is a nightmare, and the world found out the hard way. At Chernobyl, the design had that safety logic backwards. In that particular reactor, boiling the water off actually sped the reaction up instead of slowing it down. So heat made more reaction, and more reaction made more heat, and more heat made more reaction, and there was no bottom to that staircase. Once it started falling, it fell all the way. That's not what a reactor is supposed to feel like, and nearly every reactor since is built so that heat pushes the brake, never the gas. But you don't want to rely only on physics being in a good mood, you want a hand on the wheel. So there's a third piece, and it's the one the operators actually touch. Threaded down into the core, in between all the fuel, are control rods, and control rods are the opposite of fuel. They're made of stuff like boron and cadmium, and those materials are hungry. They swallow neutrons whole and give nothing back. So think about what happens when you slide the rods in. They soak up loose neutrons before those neutrons can find uranium. Fewer neutrons flying, fewer splits, the reaction quiets down. Pull the rods out, and now the neutrons have a clear path. More splits happen, the reaction wakes up. That's the throttle. Rods out, more power. Rods in, less. All the way in, the reaction chokes off and stops. An operator sitting in a control room can lift and lower the whole thing like dimming a light, and the star in the basement obeys. Now let's talk about how hot it actually gets in there, because the number is wild once you know the second half of it. The water in the core of a typical plant runs somewhere around 600 degrees Fahrenheit. And your brain should be objecting right now because water boils at 212. It should be a screaming cloud of steam long before 600. So how is it still liquid water? They squeeze it. The whole core is under enormous pressure, more than 150 times the air pressure you're sitting in right now. And when you crush water that hard, you change the rules. It refuses to boil. It just sits there, liquid, at a temperature that would flash a normal pot dry in an instant. That superheated, pressurized water is the payoff of the entire machine. Everything before this, the splitting, the neutrons, the rods, all of it exists just to make that water hot. From there, it's almost old-fashioned. The scorching water runs through a maze of pipes, and those pipes pass through a second batch of water that isn't under all that pressure. That second water flashes into steam. The steam blasts into a turbine and spins it, hard. The turbine spins a generator. The generator makes the electricity that ends up in your wall. The atoms split, and 8 or 9 steps later, your phone charges. That's the whole chain, start to finish. And the fuel doesn't run out for a long time. A reactor can go a year and a half, sometimes 2 years, on a single load of those little pellets before anyone has to open it up and swap them out. 2 years of light from something you could carry in a bucket. Here's where it stops being a fun physics lesson and gets serious. And it's the one thing most people get wrong about how reactors fail. You'd think the danger is the chain reaction running away, and sometimes it is. But there's a quieter problem, and it doesn't care whether you've shut the reactor down or not. When something goes wrong, operators can hit the emergency stop. It's called a scram. All the control rods slam down into the core at once, in a couple of seconds, and the chain reaction just stops. Dead. No more splitting. You'd think that's the end of it. You'd think the danger's over. It isn't. Not even close. Because all those broken atom pieces left behind by the reaction, the leftovers, are radioactive, and they keep pouring out heat all on their own. No chain reaction needed. It's like turning off a stove and finding the burner is still glowing red, and it's going to keep glowing for days no matter what you do. Right after a shutdown, the core is still making around 6 or 7% of its full heat, from nothing but that leftover glow. And 6 or 7% of a nuclear reactor is still an absurd amount of heat. So even after you've stopped it, you cannot walk away. You have to keep pumping water through it, cooling it, for hours, then days, while that heat slowly fades. Stop cooling it, and the leftover heat alone is enough to melt the fuel into slag. That's exactly what happened at Fukushima. People think the reactors failed to shut down. They didn't. The scram worked perfectly. The rods dropped, the chain reaction stopped, everything went as designed. Then the tsunami drowned the pumps, the cooling died, and that quiet leftover heat, the burner that won't stop glowing, cooked the cores from the inside with nobody able to stop it. The reaction was already off. The heat didn't care. That's the thing to remember. You can turn off the splitting in a second. You can't turn off the heat. A reactor isn't a light you switch off. It's a fire you have to talk down slowly, even after the flame is out. You want to know the strangest part? The first time humans ever did this on purpose, it happened under the bleachers of a football stadium, and the safety system was a guy with an axe. December of 1942. University of Chicago. A physicist named Enrico Fermi and his team stacked up a lump of graphite and uranium in an empty squash court, a pile so plain they literally just called it a pile. No dome, no concrete fortress, no computers. To control it, they pulled out rods by hand and watched the clicking counters speed up. And their emergency plan, in case the whole thing started running away, was a young man standing over the pile holding a rope. On the other end of that rope hung a safety rod. If things went bad, his job was to cut the rope with an axe and let the rod drop in and kill the reaction. That's the story people tell about where the word scram even comes from. Safety control, rod axeman. Historians still argue about whether that's the real origin or a good story people like too much to give up, but the picture is true either way. The dawn of nuclear power was a handful of people in a cold room, betting they'd done the math right, with a guy and a hatchet as the backup plan, and they were right. The pile came alive, held steady, and they shut it back down. First controlled chain reaction in history, in a squash court, with a rope. So come back to right now. The lights are still on. Nothing's changed in your room. But now you know what's actually happening on the other end of that wire. Somewhere out there, in a building behind a fence, atoms of uranium are splitting apart, throwing off neutrons that water is slowing to a crawl, held in perfect balance by rods that can choke the whole thing off in 2 seconds. Boiling water that's been squeezed so hard it forgets how to boil, all so a turbine can spin and your switch can mean something. We took the same reaction that lives inside a bomb, the most destructive thing our species ever made, and we tamed it down to a slow, patient simmer. We slowed the bullets. We built a throttle out of metal that eats neutrons. We turned a runaway into a workhorse, and then we made it so ordinary that you flip it on without a thought and complain when it flickers. There's a tiny piece of a star burning in a basement somewhere near you tonight. It's been burning the whole time you watch this, and it'll still be burning long after you've forgotten it was ever there.